Rohit Mehra and Charlotte Green, two strangers bound by a fake marriage, driven by desperation, greed, and lies. What began as a quiet immigration deal in Birmingham would soon unravel into a chilling nightmare of control, abuse, and murder, a story where love was never real, but the violence became fatally real. In 2018, Rohit Mehra boarded a flight from Delhi to Birmingham with a heart full of hope and a suitcase that carried everything he owned. He was 25, the first in his family to travel abroad, and his parents had done everything they could to make it possible. They had sold part of their ancestral land, borrowed money from relatives, and prayed for their son's success. To them, this journey symbolized a future beyond struggle. For Rohit, it was a chance to rewrite his story, to escape the endless expectations of home and find his place in a new world. When he arrived in the UK, reality hit harder than the cold wind that greeted him outside the airport. The city felt strange, fast, and lonely. He rented a small room in a shared house with two other international students and started attending his engineering classes at a university known more for its diversity than its prestige. His English was good enough for lectures, but conversations in pubs or classrooms made him anxious. He took a part-time job stacking shelves at a local grocery store, where he earned just enough to pay rent and eat instant noodles most nights. Over time, the pressure began to build. His student visa required full-time enrollment, which meant he couldn't work enough hours to make ends meet legally. Back home, his father's calls grew shorter, always circling around the same topic: money. His mother asked if he was eating properly, while he lied, saying everything was fine. In truth, he was barely surviving. One Friday evening, after finishing a late shift, Rohit stopped by a pub to warm up before heading home. That's where he met Charlotte Green. She was 30, loud, confident, and had a laugh that filled the room. She worked behind the bar, serving drinks with the kind of ease that comes only from years in the same routine. Rohit ordered tea, something she found amusing in a room full of beer drinkers. She started talking, curious about his accent and story. For Rohit, who had spent months in quiet isolation, the attention felt comforting. They met again a few times by chance, then by intention. Charlotte had her own struggles. Her job barely covered rent, and she had a history of bad relationships and unpaid bills. One evening, as they sat outside after closing, she mentioned knowing someone who had once married a foreign student for money. She laughed as she said it, but it didn't. The idea sank into his mind like a seed. Over the next few weeks, the casual conversation turned into a plan. Charlotte agreed to a deal: they would get married so he could stay in the country legally, and in return, she would receive 800. The arrangement was simple. They registered their marriage quietly with only 2 witnesses. Rohit wired her half the money immediately and promised the rest after his permanent visa was approved. They moved into a small apartment together to make the marriage look real to immigration officers. Charlotte seemed satisfied at first, enjoying the new financial comfort. Rohit, relieved to have solved his biggest problem, believed his troubles were finally over. But he was wrong. Beneath the surface of their fake marriage, something uneasy began to grow: resentment, jealousy, and a power that shifted with every passing day. What started as a deal built on lies was slowly transforming into something neither of them could control. It was only the beginning of a chain of events that would turn both their lives into a tragedy the world would later struggle to believe. At first, the arrangement between Rohit and Charlotte seemed manageable. They both had what they wanted: he had stability, and she had money. But the fragile balance began to crumble only a few months after they started living together. Charlotte's carefree personality, which once seemed charming, quickly revealed its darker edges. She drank heavily, often returning home late at night with friends, filling their small apartment with loud music and cigarette smoke. Rohit, worried about drawing unwanted attention from neighbors or immigration officers, tried to stay calm. He would clean up after her, make excuses when the landlord complained, and do everything possible to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage. But Charlotte wasn't content. She wanted more money, more control, more attention. She started asking Rohit for extra cash, claiming she had taken a huge risk by marrying him. When he explained that his finances were tight, she would remind him in a cold voice that their marriage was a crime. The threat of being exposed hung over him like a noose. She would wave it in his face whenever he disagreed with her. He was trapped legally, emotionally, and financially. Rohit tried to distract himself with work and studies, spending long hours at the library just to avoid being home. His roommate from before, Arav Desai, noticed the change in him. Once cheerful and ambitious, Rohit now looked tired and nervous. When Arav came to visit one weekend, Charlotte refused to let him in. She claimed Rohit was too busy to meet anyone. That was the first time Arav realized how much control she had gained over him. He tried to warn Rohit later, but the calls went unanswered. Inside the apartment, the tension was unbearable. Charlotte's drinking made her unpredictable. Some nights she would laugh and dance around the kitchen, and other nights she would explode in anger over the smallest thing. Once, she smashed his phone because he didn't answer her calls while at work. Another time, she threw his clothes out the window during an argument. Rohit's attempts to reason with her only fueled her rage. He began sleeping on the couch, quietly enduring the storm. The abuse escalated from shouting to physical violence. She would slap him, push him, and once even cut his arm with broken glass when a fight got out of control. Rohit started covering his injuries with long sleeves, telling classmates he had accidents at work. He didn't dare tell anyone the truth. He feared that if the authorities found out about the fake marriage, not only would he be deported, but his family's sacrifices would mean nothing. Charlotte's threats became more frequent. She started messaging him during his classes, demanding money and accusing him of using her. When he stopped responding, she sent voice notes filled with insults and promises to report him. Each day became a battle for survival, and Rohit's silence only made her cruelty bolder. The neighbors began to notice too. They often heard shouting, crashing sounds, and once even the sound of someone crying. But no one intervened. To them, it was just another couple fighting. By the end of 2019, Rohit's life had completely unraveled. He was failing his courses, skipping shifts at work, and avoiding friends. The relationship, once fake but harmless, had become a prison built on fear and manipulation. The apartment that was supposed to protect his future had turned into a cage he couldn't escape from. What neither of them knew was that the anger and desperation brewing inside those walls would soon explode into a tragedy that would shock everyone who knew them. By early 2019, the signs of abuse on Rohit were no longer easy to hide. He would show up to class with bruises along his jaw, cuts on his hands, and red marks on his neck. When friends asked what had happened, he would smile weakly and say he had fallen off his bike or tripped while carrying groceries. Nobody questioned it much. He was quiet, polite, and never one to make a scene. But behind closed doors, his life was collapsing piece by piece. Charlotte had turned their apartment into a battleground. Her drinking grew heavier, her moods darker, and her violence more unpredictable. Most evenings began the same way. She would drink, complain about money, and accuse Rohit of taking advantage of her. When she was sober, she sometimes acted kind and apologetic, promising to change, but those moments never lasted. The abuse returned stronger each time, as if she resented him for making her feel guilty. Rohit began to fear coming home. He would linger at the university library until it closed, dreading the sound of her voice when he unlocked the door. His roommate from before, Arav Desai, noticed the change whenever they met on campus. Rohit had lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and he seemed constantly on edge. Arav offered to let him stay at his flat for a few days, but Rohit refused. He knew Charlotte would find him. She checked his phone, monitored his messages, and once followed him to the store just to make sure he wasn't meeting anyone. What had started as a fake marriage for convenience had become an all-consuming nightmare. In his desperation, Rohit began keeping a secret record of everything that happened. He downloaded a voice recorder app and started capturing her outbursts whenever he could. The recordings were filled with slurred shouting, crashing furniture, and her voice spewing threats and insults. He didn't know why he was doing it, maybe for protection, maybe to remind himself he wasn't imagining the horror. He saved the files on a hidden folder in his phone, labeling them with random names so she wouldn't find out. Late one night, after an especially violent fight, he finally confided in someone, his classmate and close friend, Nisha Kapoor. Nisha was a journalism student from Mumbai who had always admired Rohit's quiet determination. When he sent her the audio clips, she was horrified. She urged him to go to the police immediately, but Rohit refused. He was terrified that reporting her would expose the fake marriage and lead to his deportation. Every choice he had came with consequences that could destroy his future. Nisha, unable to stay silent, saved copies of the recordings in her email, hoping she might convince him later to seek help. But Rohit was too far gone. His confidence had vanished, replaced by a kind of hopeless acceptance. He lived day to day, careful not to provoke Charlotte, speaking only when necessary. The fear had become part of him, a quiet, constant ache that never left. Outside, no one suspected the depth of his suffering. The neighbors sometimes heard the noise but brushed it off as typical domestic tension. A few of them noticed that Charlotte often shouted in the hallways or cursed him in public, but no one reported it. Rohit's professors assumed his poor performance was due to stress or homesickness. Everyone saw fragments of the truth, but no one saw the whole picture. By the time winter arrived, Rohit was trapped in a life that no longer felt his own. The bruises healed, but the shame didn't. He knew he had to escape, yet every plan he made was crushed by the same fear. If he left her, she would go to the authorities. She reminded him of that every day. What he didn't realize was that his secret recordings, the ones he made in silence and desperation, would soon become the most powerful evidence, not just of her cruelty, but of the tragedy that was waiting to unfold. It was a cold February night in 2020 when everything finally spiraled out of control. The tension between Rohit and Charlotte had reached its breaking point. For weeks, Charlotte had been drinking heavily, staying out late, and accusing Rohit of planning to abandon her after using her for immigration papers. In truth, he had finally made up his mind to leave. He had written an email to the Indian embassy asking for help and booked a one-way ticket to Delhi. He had hidden his passport in his backpack, intending to slip away quietly, but Charlotte found out before he could go. Earlier that evening, she had gone through his laptop while he was asleep and discovered the flight confirmation. When he woke up, she was already drunk, holding a bottle of wine in one hand and his passport in the other. Her face was red with anger, and her voice was shaking as she screamed at him. Rohit tried to calm her, but the more he spoke, the more violent she became. She accused him of betraying her, of lying, of using her from the start. The argument escalated until she threw his laptop across the room, shattering it against the wall. Neighbors later told police they heard loud noises around 2 a.m., shouting, glass breaking, furniture being moved. One witness said it sounded like someone pleading. Inside the apartment, the scene was chaotic. Charlotte attacked Rohit with the empty bottle, cutting his forehead. He tried to defend himself, but she kept hitting him. In the struggle, he pushed her away, and she fell backward, hitting the corner of the glass coffee table. The sound of the impact was sharp and final. She collapsed instantly, her head bleeding, eyes half open. Rohit froze. For a few seconds he stood there, unable to move or process what had just happened. He knelt beside her, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. The room was silent except for the sound of the rain hitting the window. His hands trembled as he tried to stop the bleeding with a towel. He called her name again and again, but it was too late. Panic set in, and he began pacing the room, unsure what to do. He thought about running, about calling someone, about ending his own life. At 2:45 a.m., a neighbor named Mary Jenkins, who lived below them, dialed 999 after hearing a loud crash followed by complete silence. When police arrived 10 minutes later, they found the apartment door unlocked. Inside, Charlotte Green was lying on the floor near the shattered table, surrounded by blood. It was sitting against the wall, dazed and pale, holding a broken photo frame of the two of them. He had a deep cut on his forehead and bruises along his arms. Paramedics pronounced Charlotte dead at the scene. It was taken into custody, barely able to speak. To the officers, it looked like a domestic murder, a violent husband killing his wife during an argument. But within hours, the case began to shift. Detectives found signs that contradicted the initial assumption. Multiple bruises on Rohit's body that were days old, broken objects scattered in ways suggesting a struggle, and messages on his phone showing that Charlotte had been threatening him. When forensic teams recovered his phone, they discovered dozens of hidden audio files, each containing evidence of months of abuse. The recordings painted a disturbing picture of what had really been happening in that small apartment. The roles of victim and abuser were not as clear as they first appeared. What seemed like a simple case of domestic violence had turned into something far more complex, a tangled story of manipulation, fear, and desperation that would soon grip both the British and Indian media. The night Charlotte died marked the end of their toxic relationship, but it also marked the beginning of a truth the world wasn't ready to hear. The days following Charlotte's death were a blur of confusion, headlines, and interrogation. Rohit was kept in custody at a Birmingham detention center, barely speaking, still in shock. The news broke quickly, Indian student murders British wife in drunken brawl, and within hours, social media was flooded with outrage. People called him a liar, a scammer, an opportunist who used a woman for citizenship. No one knew the truth yet, but judgments came easily. Meanwhile, investigators worked to piece together what had really happened inside that apartment. When detectives analyzed Rohit's phone, they uncovered more than anyone expected: over 20 recordings documenting months of physical and verbal abuse. The audio files captured Charlotte screaming, threatening, throwing objects, and accusing him of cheating. In several clips, her voice slurred with alcohol, while Rohit's was quiet, pleading, and scared. The evidence completely changed the direction of the investigation. Suddenly, the victim didn't appear to be the woman who had died, but the man who had survived. Nisha Kapoor, the friend who had received some of the recordings, was called in for questioning. She confirmed that Rohit had sent her the evidence weeks before the incident. She handed over her email copies and explained how he had been too afraid to go to the police because of the fake marriage. Her testimony, along with Arav's statements about Charlotte's controlling behavior, began to reveal a different narrative, one of long-term abuse and psychological torment. The court hearings were emotional and heavily publicized. The prosecution painted Rohit as a manipulative man who married Charlotte for papers and turned violent when she confronted him. The defense, however, presented the recordings, photos of his injuries, and witness accounts of Charlotte's aggression. The evidence was undeniable. Rohit had suffered months of abuse, and the fatal blow was not premeditated. The coroner's report confirmed that Charlotte's head injury was consistent with a fall during a struggle, not a direct assault. After weeks of trial, the judge delivered the verdict. Rohit Mehra was found guilty of manslaughter instead of murder. The court acknowledged that he had acted in panic and self-defense during a prolonged period of domestic violence. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with time reduced for cooperation and mental health considerations. The judge called it a tragedy born from fear, lies, and desperation. The story went viral again, but this time public opinion was divided. Some saw Rohit as a victim trapped in an impossible situation, while others still viewed him as a man who had exploited a broken system. The Indian media focused on the fake marriage scandal, while British outlets highlighted the domestic abuse angle. Across social networks, debates raged about immigration, mental health, and the hidden struggles of male victims of abuse. In prison, Rohit spent most of his days in silence. He wrote letters to his parents, apologizing for everything and explaining that he never meant for any of it to happen. His mother's replies were filled with prayers and forgiveness, though she never mentioned Charlotte by name. Arav visited him once, saying that Nisha had turned the story into a short documentary about toxic relationships built on lies. It gained millions of views, sparking conversations about the unseen sides of domestic violence. When it was released years later, he returned quietly to India, avoiding reporters who waited at the airport. He had lost his freedom, his education, and his dream, but he had also learned how a single lie could spiral into catastrophe. The fake marriage meant to secure his future had destroyed everything instead. Charlotte's death remained an open wound in his memory, a reminder that truth and deception, love and hate, survival and guilt, can all live in the same story. In the end, 2 lives were ruined not by evil, but by fear of being exposed, fear of losing control, and fear of a truth that came too late to save either of them.